Hi, everybody. This is Natasha, and this is episode 1 of Natasha Explains It All. Yes, I am a child of the 90s. I'm a millennial, and so this is an homage to Clarissa Explains It All, fantastic TV show. And I was encouraged by friends to launch this podcast. And they've been talking about this for a while, and they were the ones who gave me the idea for the name of the podcast. I have no idea if this is going to be one episode, and then I never do this again, or if I will do this on a regular basis. So the goal with this podcast is just to basically convert the WhatsApp audios that I already leave my friends and family that are super long about current events or, ways to get involved in your community and put them on a more public platform. So we'll see. Um, the topic for today, opening this podcast, is going to be about Brazil and the United States. Important context: I am a dual U.S. and Brazilian citizen, and so this is a very personal topic to me. So, as you may have been reading, last Sunday, which was January 8th, in Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, which, fun fact, is in the shape of an airplane. If you look it up, you can see that Brasilia was designed to be in the shape of an airplane. It's another story. But anyway, in Brasilia, which is the capital of Brazil, on Sunday, January 8th, thousands of Bolsonaro supporters invaded the presidential palace, the congressional hall, and the Supreme Court and caused massive damage. And the reason that they were there was to protest the prior president, Jair Bolsonaro's loss of the presidential election in October. And they wanted the military to intervene and to overturn the election, which Bolsonaro lost and which brought back to power a former president, a leftist president, Lula. And unsurprisingly, parallels were made immediately between what was happening in Brazil and what happened on January 6th of 2021 in the United States, because the exact same thing happened. In the United States, you had MAGA supporters, Trump supporters, also in complete denial about reality, went to the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol, invaded the Capitol, caused massive damage to both property and persons. And their complaint was that they believed that the 2020 presidential election had been stolen from Trump, and they wanted the military to intervene and to reinstall Trump as president. So really serious parallels between the demands and actions of supporters of Bolsonaro in Brazil and Trump in the United States. And there's so many ties between these two events. One of many being that Steve Bannon, who was an advisor to Donald Trump, is also an advisor to Bolsonaro. And so he is a chaos agent that's been advising both the former American government and the former Brazilian government, and spreading misinformation and lies about, election results and, voting electronically and things like that. And the response that we've seen so far in Brazil. One thing before I turn to that. One difference is that the Bolsonaro supporters went on a Sunday And fortunately, like the congressional offices and everything were empty, meaning that there were no people there, no, congressional members or staffers or anything. In contrast to January 6th insurrection in the United States, where Congress was in session, Congress was in the process of certifying the 2020 election results. Um, so what I wanted to mention next is that we've seen a really serious contrast in how Brazil has immediately responded to this coup attempt versus the response in the United States. Some of the things that happened right away that were quite a show of force were that uh, I don't know the exact number, but at least 1,500 people who were there and participated in the insurrection in Brasilia on January 8th were arrested that same day and taken into custody. The Supreme Court of Brazil also suspended the governor of the state of the federal district for 90 days. So a bit different from the United States because DC doesn't have state status, though it is, a separate legal entity. In Brazil, the federal district where Brasilia is located is its own state. And so the governor of the federal district is a Bolsonaro supporter, and the Supreme Court suspended his authority for 90 days based on allegations that he was for sure involved in organizing excuse me, this insurrection. And in addition, the Brazilian judiciary has frozen the accounts, the financial accounts of various high-level officials, and they're already working on the process of extraditing Bolsonaro, as well as a former justice minister of his, back to Brazil, so that they can face the consequences of their actions. When this happened, both Bolsonaro and one of his former justice ministers, Anderson Torres, were in Florida and remain in Florida. So they weren't there on the actual day of this attack. And Bolsonaro had actually fled to Florida, which seems to be a home for many former despots. He was there. He's been there since December 30th. So he wasn't there. He wasn't in Brazil for the inauguration of Lula, which was on January 1st. And so Bolsonaro is still in the United States. One of his former ministers is still in the United States, in Florida. Bolsonaro was in the hospital recently as well, related to intestinal issues. During his presidential campaign, he was stabbed by someone who opposed, his candidacy, and that's been causing some ongoing health problems. So it sounds like this hospitalization might be related to that. But anyway, both Bolsonaro and his former minister, Anderson Torres, have both said that they're planning to return to Brazil and will deal with things. We'll see. But in the meantime, there have been many, unfortunately only Democratic members of Congress who have called on the United States to revoke Bolsonaro's diplomatic visa that is allowing him to be in the United States so that he can be sent back to Brazil and to face justice. In addition to those things, in terms of having this really, really strong response, just a couple of other examples, and then I'll give my 2 cents as to why I think there's such a contrast there. The day after this attack, Lula went to Brasilia and went down, there's a ramp that goes down from the presidential palace to, I don't know, kind of this public area, and he went down that ramp arm in arm with all 27 governors of all states of Brazil in a showing of solidarity that, the country was united against what had just happened. And in addition to that, at least the media reports that I've seen and the thing, how public officials in Brazil and media outlets in Brazil have been talking about this. They've been very explicit in calling this a fascist attack. They've been very specific in referring to the people who attacked, the government buildings as domestic terrorists, as calling this an anti-democratic movement. And I think, I if you're following the news in the United States, like these things seem incredible, and like how would this ever happen in the United States? I mean, we don't have that kind of bipartisan condemnation of this type of right wing extremism. There was a survey that was done that I saw in Brazil, and 93% of the population, as of right now, is condemning the attack. I don't think the statistic has ever been that high in the United States. And I mean, think about how last Friday, on January 6th of 2023, members of Congress as well as Biden got together to commemorate the second anniversary of the January 6th attack. And my understanding is that there was only one, Republican member of Congress who appeared for that. And I mean, the Republicans that have a stranglehold on their party, at least in the House, are those who were the orchestrators of, certainly involved in the January 6th attack, giving quote unquote tours of the Capitol in the days leading up to the insurrection, firm Trump supporters, engaging with the people who came and attacked. And it's just like the idea, the image of Biden, linking arm in arm with all, all governors, to make this showing of commitment to democracy. It just doesn't seem fathomable because we are so polarized. And yet, Brazil is also really, really, really polarized. The Bolsonaro presidency had so many parallels to the Trump presidency. And the country remains really, really polarized. But just one theory I have as to why the Brazilian response has been, at least in these initial days, seemed to be so much stronger, so much more united, so much more decisive than the American response has been so far. Even though there's obviously ongoing investigations and cases and, judicial processes going on. I think the reason in Brazil is that the threat of a military dictatorship, right? The threat of fascism is actually still really salient. Brazil only became a democracy in 1985, following 20 years of military dictatorship, very similar to its neighbors, Argentina and Chile. Brazil went through a similar time with similar forms of repression and anti-democratic norms. And so, like, 1985 was yesterday in historical terms. And I wonder if that's contributing to it, that people understand what this could actually mean, like what fascism actually means very concretely. And that was a very explicit part of Bolsonaro's presidency. He was constantly lauding how life was better when we had, the ditadura militar. He praised that time. And, and so that became part of the rhetoric of his supporters as well. And so the United States, at least for white Americans, it doesn't feel, I guess, that tangible. And so there's so many people that can just, um, you know, say like it was, not good, but like it's not that big of a deal. And so we're going to continue to elect MAGA people who have zero interest in promoting democracy. They are chaos agents, and they're just looking for their spot, on the next Fox News segment. And yeah, I wonder if that is contributing to why Brazil has responded in such a strong and decisive manner so far. I don't think it's because democratic norms are weaker in Brazil than they are in the United States. I think it's simply because the memory of what life not in a democracy is still so fresh. And, it like, this raises so many interesting issues about like contrasting these different forms of democracy. Um, and like one of the things is that part of these right wing conspiracy theories that have fueled this stop the steal movement in both the United States and Brazil is all of this, unfounded conspiracy around doing electronic voting. And, in Brazil has one voting system, unlike the United States that has, I don't know how many, right? Because it's not even every state has their own systems. Like every county, everybody's got a different system. In Brazil, there's one system and one system only. Everybody votes electronically. Everybody votes on a Sunday. It's not a Tuesday. It's on a Sunday. Everyone votes electronically, and voting is mandatory in Brazil. The penalty for not voting is a fine. It's very, very small. It's like a few reais, which is the Brazilian currency, and you can provide excuses. If you were sick or traveling or something else, like there's an app. It's called e-Título. Everyone is issued like you have a voter ID kind of document. It's called Título Eleitor, your like electoral title. And there's an app called e-Título that you use you can store your information in there. You can provide, your excuse as to why you weren't able to vote. And then even if you do vote, you are allowed to vote blank, right? Like you can just not vote for anyone. And if you are a Brazilian citizen who lives abroad, like me, you're only required to vote in the presidential election, so only every 4 years. And then the various consulates around the world will make themselves available on those Sundays. And you go there and you do the same thing. It's all electronic, and that's it. And so Brazil's been doing this for decades. For many, many decades. And it's interesting that only because, again, of the workings of people like Steve Bannon and Stephen Miller and these other chaos agents who have been trying to foment discord in democracies around the world, that there's now like this movement within Brazil to question whether whether that voting is secure, and whether we can really trust the results. And it's disturbing and fascinating to see that happen. People starting to question something that's happened in Brazil without issue for many, many decades. And the other thing that's really fabulous about having a uniform system throughout the entire country that's all electronic, and everyone votes, and it's all on the same day, is that you get the results the same day. Right away, who won and who lost. We don't have the same type, or in Brazil, there's not the same types of delay that you have in the United States. And there's no electoral college nonsense, like trying to explain to my Brazilian family how the electoral college works. Like, they're so confused, right? Like, on the days of our presidential elections, why we don't know the same day who won. And it's like, it's very confusing to me as well. It's confusing to Americans. It doesn't make sense. Um, it's a very anti-democratic norm. And so in Brazil, like, they have direct elections. They have one person, one vote elections. We do not. In the United States, we do not. The Electoral College makes it so the person who wins the popular vote won't necessarily win the presidency, right? Which is what happened most recently in the 2016 election that Trump won. But in many of the most recent elections, where Republicans have won the presidency, they've lost the popular vote, but because of the way that the Electoral College is set up, that they've won anyway. And so, like, I remember talking to a relative in Brazil, um, uh, when I was there recently at the end of last year. And and he's a Bolsonaro supporter, and he was like talking about how, yeah, like, we don't know, like, we can't trust these electronic voting systems. And like, and I'm trying to remember exactly, he was trying to compare it to another country. And he was saying something like, well, that's not what they do in certain European countries. So our system, meaning the Brazilian system, must be inferior, like, there must be a problem with that. And my response to that was simply to say, there's more than one way of doing things. Like, there's more than one quote unquote right way of doing things. And so I don't know if that's been part of the conspiracy theories, that have been circulating as well. It's like, oh, well, certain European countries don't do it in this way. They don't have, one uniform system and all electronic voting. So therefore, now suddenly the Brazilian method is, bad. But just a reminder that, like, more than one reality can exist at a time. And 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 yeah, just like, interesting that it's not like these systems can never improve, but it is very deliberate to foment this distrust and this discord at this particular time. It's not a coincidence. And at that same event where I was talking to this relative, I was talking to another relative, a distant relative, about, well, I didn't want to get in, I didn't want to get into politics, but this person did. And it just reminded me again of what parallels there are between the United States and Brazil in terms of what the Trump administration, what the Bolsonaro administration and their movements, the MAGA and then the Bolsominions, what they represent, as the world is facing really, really serious challenges, whether that be global warming, whether that be war. We have, like, really, really serious, in the United States, gun violence. My God, right? We have these really, really serious systemic issues. And the right-wing response, which is a very reactionary force, is to try to hyper-focus on either non-existent problems, like all of the critical race theory, fear-mongering, right, making up problems, or scapegoating the most vulnerable people so that we're not focusing on the increasing wealth inequality, right, and the ruling class and how their concentration of power is resulting in attacks on worker rights, is not allowing us to properly address the climate crisis and many other issues. And so this particular relative was, trying to convince me that, like, Bolsonaro was good and Lula was bad. And, was telling me that, like, Lula supports homosexuality and he supports abortion. And, my response to that was, well, I support those things, and it's so funny, like, the topics are the same, in both the MAGA camp and in the Bolsonaro camp. Like, queer people, gay people, trans people, they are the enemy, that we must limit their existence. because they're the real cause of, problems right now, which is inaccurate, but also just like such a classic move when there is social change and when there is social upheaval to scapegoat already vulnerable populations. And at the same time of scapegoating vulnerable populations, another very reactionary fascist tool is control, right? Government control of people, which ironically is what they all think that is happening. And yet they are the ones imposing that control. And that's how the abortion issue comes up, for example, right? Um, this urge to literally control people's bodies and people's freedom, and return to more traditional roles, right? And those issues are interrelated, right? In these times of change, there's like this push to go back to a binary. There's a push to go back to quote unquote, simple times where it just, this is what a man is and this is what a woman is and nothing else. I read today like the Missouri State Congress was like voting today on updating their dress code for members of Congress of the state of Missouri. Um, and they were changing the dress code to make it stricter for women. So that like the specific rules about like wearing a blazer, so your arms aren't showing, God forbid. And it's like all these issues are interrelated, of wanting to control people so that they're living in fear and don't have the same freedom and ability to counter what's happening. Um, while the powers that be concentrate their power even more to the detriment of everyone, except for a very, very small segment of the population, and then scapegoating of very vulnerable populations. And another common thread is, the fascist symbolism of co-opting of the flag. MAGA supporters have really adopted the American flag and the American colors as a symbol of their patriotism and their support for MAGA. Same in Brazil with Bolsonaro supporters wearing the Brazilian flag, wearing the Brazilian colors, and such that as an act of protest after Bolsonaro lost the election, many Brazilians displayed Brazilian flags in their, apartment windows or, windows in their home or on their cars, as a sign of protest, which got a little dicey at the end of last year with the World Cup because Brazilians are super, 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 super patriotic about the World Cup. And want to wear the national colors of the team. But some people were concerned about being confused with Bolsonaro supporters. So I don't know, there's like this weird thing of like, is that person like supporting, the national team because of the World Cup? Or are they, a Bolsonaro supporter that is contesting the election results, their protest against Bolsonaro's loss. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this one up here. Just some thoughts and some context about some parallels happening between the US and Brazil, a lot more development still to come. I hope that this was helpful and gives a little bit more context to everything that's going on, and what we can learn from different countries and their experiences. And yeah, an opportunity for the United States to learn from Brazil, and its own experience to really take this threat seriously. And so we'll see what happens. So thanks for listening, and maybe there will be another episode. We'll see.